He thought she was just a quiet child in need of shelter, but the girl he adopted had already discovered the danger living under his roof. Clara Hayes was only 8 years old, but she had already learned lessons most adults never understood. In the foster homes before this one, silence had been her armor. Speaking too quickly, asking questions, or drawing attention to herself had always ended badly. So she learned to keep her head down, her ears open, and her thoughts tucked away where no one could reach them. Watching kept her safe. Watching told her who could be trusted, and who only pretended to care. Now she lived in a glass-walled mansion that felt more like a museum than a home, but her instincts had not changed. She moved quietly through the hallways, never heavy-footed, never careless, her brown eyes always scanning, always noticing details that adults missed. Daniel Ward was her adoptive father, though the word still felt strange on her tongue. He was one of those men whose names appeared in magazines and whose face showed up on news broadcasts when people talked about wealth and power. He had built a tech empire before turning 35, and people said his mind worked like a machine, always calculating, always moving 3 steps ahead. To Clara, he was still mostly a stranger, a man who had brought her into his home but not yet into his life. He provided her with everything she needed: the nicest school, a bedroom that looked like something from a catalog, shelves filled with books and toys. But when he passed her in the hallway, his smile was often distracted, his thoughts still tied to the numbers and contracts glowing on his screens. He was kind in a distant way, polite, but never fully present. Clara felt like a guest, temporary and replaceable. Even though papers said she belonged to him now, the mansion itself seemed alive, filled with glass walls that reflected every movement and sleek surfaces that carried the hum of hidden machines. The clocks ticked in perfect rhythm, the security system blinked softly at night, and the cameras in the hallways turned with small mechanical sighs. To Daniel, all of it was protection. To Clara, it was another thing to watch. She had a habit of standing in corners, unseen, her eyes following the patterns of light and shadow across the polished floors. At night, she would lie in her bed, staring at the faint glow of devices in the dark, counting the little blinks of red and green, as if they were stars. She remembered her mother once saying that truth often lived in details, and Clara believed that more with every passing day. When Daniel's fiancée Vanessa visited, the mansion changed. The air grew brighter, filled with her laughter and perfume, but Clara noticed things that didn't match the smiles. Vanessa's eyes flickered too quickly when she thought no one was watching. Her hands lingered too long on doors and desks, and she always seemed to know exactly where Daniel was before he told her. Clara never said anything, not yet, but she stored each detail like a bead on a string. Silence was still her weapon, and observation was her gift. One day soon, she would need both. For now, she moved carefully through the mansion, unseen but always listening, a quiet shadow in the life of a man who didn't yet realize how much he needed her. Daniel's office was the one place in the mansion where Clara almost never felt welcome. It was sleek and polished, filled with glowing screens, leather chairs, and walls lined with shelves that displayed awards and books Daniel probably had no time to read. The air always carried the faint hum of machines, the constant whisper of technology running in the background. When he worked, he barely looked up from the lines of numbers and charts scrolling across his computer screen, his fingers moving quickly over the keys, his voice steady as he spoke into headsets about deals worth more than she could imagine. To Clara, the office was like a glass fortress, cold and untouchable, but it was also where she began to notice something that unsettled her. On the mantel above the fireplace sat an ornate brass clock, heavy and old-fashioned, a strange contrast to the modern furniture and spotless design of the room. Vanessa had given it to Daniel a few weeks earlier, insisting that the office needed something elegant, something timeless, to balance all the cold machines. Daniel had laughed, charmed as always by her smile, and placed the gift on display without a second thought. Clara had watched the moment quietly, her small hands folded in front of her, her wide eyes noticing what the adults ignored. She knew gifts were never just gifts, not in her experience, and she had filed that thought away like she always did, silent but remembering. At first, the clock seemed harmless. It ticked steadily, its brass frame catching the light during the day, its hands moving in perfect rhythm. But at night, when the office was empty and the rest of the house had gone still, Clara began to see something else. She would pass the open doorway on her way to the kitchen for water, or slip down the hall when sleep refused to come, and in the darkened room, she noticed a faint pulse, a tiny red blink, so soft it could almost be missed, came from behind the clock's frame. Once she thought it was her imagination, just a reflection from one of the other devices. But the second night she saw it again, steady and deliberate, flashing like a secret heartbeat in the shadows. Clara's chest tightened each time she saw it. She knew what hidden things looked like, what people tried to bury when they thought no one was watching. In the homes she had lived in before, she had seen too many secrets, whispered conversations through thin walls, adults smiling in the day but changing faces at night. This was the same. Something about that blinking light told her the clock was more than just a clock. She never touched it, but she circled the room when no one else was around, standing on her toes to study the angles of the brass frame, listening to the faint hum that seemed out of place with the ticking of its hands. Her instincts told her something was wrong, and she trusted those instincts more than anything. Daniel might not notice, too distracted by contracts and numbers, but she saw it. The clock on the mantel was not what it seemed, and Clara would be the one to uncover the truth it was hiding. Daniel had been at his desk for hours, the blue glow of his computer screen reflecting off his sharp features, his voice steady as he spoke into the headset about mergers and contracts worth billions. The office around him was quiet, except for the hum of machines, the clicking of keys, and the steady ticking of the ornate brass clock on the mantel. He barely noticed Clara standing in the doorway, her small frame hidden against the glass wall, her brown eyes following every movement he made. To him it was just another late night in a string of late nights, another deal that demanded his attention. To her, it was something else entirely. She had been waiting for the right moment, her fingers curling against the fabric of her shirt, her heart pounding in her chest. She had tried before to speak to him, to share the things she noticed, but Daniel always gave her the same distracted smile, the kind that belonged to a man who was already somewhere else in his mind. Tonight she could not stay silent. The blinking red light from the clock had burned into her thoughts for too many nights now, and the fear of what it meant grew stronger with every passing hour. Clara stepped closer, her soft footsteps lost under the sound of Daniel's conversation. She tugged gently at his sleeve, just enough to make him feel her presence. Without looking away from the screen, he lifted his hand, the gesture quick and dismissive, the universal signal for wait. But Clara had been waiting for days, carrying the weight of her discovery alone, and she knew if she did not speak now, she might lose her chance. She tugged again, firmer this time, until he finally glanced down at her. His eyes were tired, his mouth forming the words of reassurance he gave without thinking. "Just a second, sweetheart." Clara leaned closer, her lips almost against his ear, her voice barely more than breath. "There's a microphone in your clock," she whispered, "but it's not yours." Dio. The words struck him harder than any business crisis ever had. His fingers froze above the keyboard, his voice died in his throat, and the man on the other end of the call was left speaking into silence. Daniel reached forward, ended the meeting with a curt excuse, and pulled the headset from his ear. For a long moment he did not move. The only sounds in the room, the faint ticking of the brass clock, and the quiet hum of the machines that filled the office. Slowly he turned toward Clara, his eyes searching her face in a way they never had before. "What did you say?" His voice was rough, though he had heard her perfectly. Clara's small hand lifted, pointing toward the mantel, toward the gift Vanessa had placed there, with such charm and insistence. Her eyes were wide but steady, her voice clear despite her size. "I've seen it blinking at night. It isn't just a clock." The weight of her words pressed down on Daniel, and for the first time, he saw her not as a child to be provided for, but as someone who might have just saved him from a disaster he never imagined. Daniel sat back in his chair, the words still hanging in the air between him and the little girl who stood by his desk. He wanted to laugh it off, to tell her she was imagining things, that no one would ever hide something inside a gift as innocent as a clock. The thought of microphones and secret watchers felt like the plot of a thriller, not the reality of his carefully built life. He was a man who believed in numbers, in contracts, in logic, not in whispers from children who still clutched toys to their chest at night. He rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand, his mind already trying to file Clara's words under the category of childish fantasy. But when he looked at her, really looked, he saw no trace of fantasy in her face. Her eyes were steady and far too serious for someone her age, her expression calm in a way that came only from knowing she had to be. There was no hint of play in her tone, no giggle behind her whisper. She simply stood there, watching him with the patience of someone who knew she had spoken the truth and was waiting for him to finally catch up. Daniel felt something shift uneasily in his chest, the first seed of doubt pressing against his denial. He rose from his chair slowly, his gaze moving to the mantel. The brass clock gleamed softly in the lamplight, its polished surface catching gold and amber tones, its ticking steady and innocent. It looked harmless, exactly what Vanessa had promised when she had given it to him, something elegant to bring warmth to his office of machines. He wanted to believe it was nothing more than that Clara's imagination had filled the shadows with ghosts. Still, he crossed the room and stood before it, his hand hovering above the frame. Clara came closer, her small finger lifting to point at the back of the clock. "There," she said softly, her voice calm and sure. "When the room is dark, it blinks." Daniel crouched down, feeling faintly ridiculous, and slid the clock gently away from the wall. At first, all he saw was brass and dust, the expected gears and wires of a well-crafted timepiece. But then his eyes caught the smallest glint of something else, a sliver of black metal tucked into the frame, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. His stomach tightened as he leaned closer. A pin-sized light winked red, then vanished, then returned, pulsing like a hidden heartbeat. Cold ran through him. He touched the spot with his fingertip, careful, and the truth pressed against his skin. This was not part of the clock. This was something entirely different, something placed there with purpose, something meant to hear. He looked over his shoulder at Clara, and for the first time in their short life together, she saw fear in his face. She met his gaze without flinching. "I told you," she said simply. Daniel felt the denial drain from him, leaving behind a hollow dread. Whoever had put that microphone there was not playing games. They were listening, they were watching, and they had chosen his home as their hunting ground. Daniel's hand trembled slightly as he set the clock back on the mantel, his eyes still fixed on the faint red blink hidden within the brass frame. He wanted to believe it was a mistake, some kind of harmless feature, but deep down he knew better. The look on Clara's face told him she had seen this long before he had, and unlike him, she hadn't pushed it away with denial. She had lived with it, carried it quietly, and now that she had finally spoken, he realized there was more she hadn't yet told him. "Clara," he said carefully, turning toward her. "How long have you known?" Her hands tightened on the tablet she always seemed to carry, the case worn at the corners, the screen smudged with fingerprints. "A while," she answered softly, her voice calm, though her eyes carried the weight of someone who had been waiting too long to be believed. "Since Vanessa brought the clock. But that's not the only one." Daniel frowned, his chest tightening. "What do you mean?" Clara hesitated, then crossed the room to the small backpack she had dropped by the door. She unzipped it with slow, careful movements, as though she had been waiting for this moment, as though she had known one day she would need to show him. From the bag, she pulled out a thin folder stuffed with papers, each one covered with sketches and notes in her neat, precise handwriting. She spread them on his desk, standing on tiptoe so she could arrange them in order. Daniel leaned forward, his breath catching as he looked at the pages. They weren't childish doodles. They were diagrams, maps of his own home, drawn in careful lines with small X's marking specific spots. Next to each X were notes written in tiny letters, descriptions of faint lights, unusual hums, and strange reflections she had seen in the dark. On one page, she had drawn the shape of a vase from the living room, arrows pointing to where she believed another device was hidden. Another page showed his nightstand, marked with words that chilled him, blinking, "When house is quiet, not on our network." "You did all this?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Clara nodded and tapped the screen of her tablet, waking it up. Lines of code and graphs appeared, nothing a child should know how to produce. She scrolled with her small fingers until a map of the house appeared, filled with colored dots. Some glowed green, labeled as devices Daniel recognized: his computers, his phone, the security cameras, but others were red, unmarked and unfamiliar. "I scanned for signals," Clara explained, her voice steady, as though she were giving a school report. "Most of them matched our stuff, but these don't. They don't belong to us." She pointed to the largest red dot, sitting in the exact place where the mantel clock was drawn on her sketch. "That one's the clock. But there are more. They came one by one, always after Vanessa visited." Daniel stared at her, stunned by both the evidence and the calm way she delivered it. She had been carrying this alone, piecing together a web of betrayal, with nothing but her sharp eyes and a cheap tablet. And she had been right. He felt ice settle in his chest as he realized how blind he had been, how easily deceived, while an 8-year-old had uncovered the truth. Clara's eyes met his, and for the first time, her voice wavered. "I didn't know if you'd listen. Adults don't, usually. That's why I wrote it all down, so I could prove it, if you ever asked." Daniel sank into his chair, his head heavy, his world tilting. In front of him lay proof that someone had turned his private life into an open stage. He had spent years building walls of firewalls and encryption to keep his empire safe, yet his own home, the place he should have been untouchable, had been invaded. And it was Clara, the child no one thought to listen to, who had seen it all. Daniel sat at his desk long after Clara had gone upstairs, his eyes drifting to the clock on the mantel, then to the folder of sketches and notes spread across the polished surface. The evidence was undeniable, yet part of him still wanted to cling to the image of Vanessa that he had carried for months. She had swept into his life with charm and elegance, every smile perfectly timed, every word making him believe that after years of isolation, he had finally found someone who understood him. He remembered the way she always seemed to know what he needed before he asked, how she arrived with coffee at the exact moment fatigue began to drag him down, how she placed a hand on his shoulder when his calls grew tense, how she whispered encouragement in the quiet hours when stress threatened to overwhelm him. It had felt like care, like devotion, like something real. But now, sitting in the half-light of his office, Daniel replayed those moments with new eyes, and the warmth he once felt curdled into suspicion. How had she always known the timing so perfectly, down to the minute? How had she appeared with exactly the right words, the right gestures, as though she had read his thoughts before he spoke them? He had assumed it was intuition, the natural closeness of a woman in love, but Clara's evidence forced him to see it differently. It was not intuition at all. It was access. Access to his private conversations, his late-night calls, his unguarded moments. He felt the chill crawl through him as the truth sank in. She had not been listening to his heart. She had been listening to his house. He turned his gaze to the clock, its steady tick now sounding hollow and menacing, and then his eyes fell on the other gifts Vanessa had given him. The expensive pen set that still sat untouched in the drawer, a gift she had insisted belonged on his desk, a symbol of power and refinement. The crystal vase gleaming in the living room, placed on the exact table where he often set confidential files. The leather-bound journal she had pressed into his hands one evening, urging him to write down his thoughts and ideas, calling it a keepsake for their future together. At the time he had thought her thoughtful, even romantic. Now he felt sick, as each object revealed itself not as a token of affection, but as a carefully chosen device to watch, to record, to steal. Daniel pressed his palms against his face, struggling with the weight of betrayal. He had built his fortune by guarding secrets, by staying 3 steps ahead of competitors, yet the enemy had walked straight through his front door, wearing a smile and speaking words of love. And he had welcomed her, blind to the danger, convinced he had finally found the missing piece of his life. He thought of Clara, the child he had barely taken time to know, who had seen through what he could not, and shame burned in his chest. He had ignored the sharp eyes that caught what his wealth and intelligence had missed. The house felt different now, the walls no longer protective but listening, the air itself thick with unseen watchers. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight, his thoughts circling the same truth he could not escape. Vanessa was perfect, too perfect, and in that perfection lay the trap. What once felt like love now looked like strategy. And every gift she had placed in his home was not a sign of devotion, but a weapon. Daniel sat in his office long after the lights of the city had dimmed into a soft glow beyond the glass walls, the hum of his computer muted now, the clock on the mantel ticking like a warning he could not silence. The folder of Clara's sketches and notes lay open on the desk, the pages covered with her small, precise handwriting, each line drawn with a patience that spoke of hours spent watching and recording. He stared at the diagrams of his own home, at the X marks she had drawn, where hidden devices pulsed quietly in the shadows, and something inside him shifted. For months he had thought of Clara as a responsibility, a child he had taken in because it was the right thing to do, because he had the money and the space and the means to give her a better life. But now he realized that it was not he who had saved her, but she who had saved him. He thought back to the first time he had seen her in the adoption center, sitting small and silent in the corner of the room, her eyes sharp and unblinking as she studied every person who passed by. She had not smiled, had not reached out the way some children did, desperate for attention. She had simply watched, her face calm but unreadable, as though she was deciding whether anyone in the world was worth trusting. Daniel had mistaken that silence for fragility, for the quietness of a child who had been broken too many times. Now he saw it for what it truly was, a strength that most adults never possessed, the kind of strength that kept her alive through the worst of what life had already given her. Clara appeared in the doorway then, her small hands holding the worn tablet close to her chest, her eyes searching his face as if she was still unsure if he would listen. For the first time, Daniel did not brush her off, did not tell her to wait, did not hide behind work or distractions. He gestured to the chair across from him, his voice steady but softer than she had ever heard it. "Show me everything," he said. Her steps were cautious as she crossed the room, her movements quiet but certain. She placed the tablet on the desk, her fingers moving quickly over the screen as she pulled up the files she had kept hidden. Maps of signals, streams of data, screenshots of unusual transmissions appeared before his eyes, evidence she had gathered with the focus of someone who knew she might never be believed. Daniel leaned closer, watching her explain in her simple, careful way how she had scanned the house, how she had compared what belonged to them and what did not, how she had followed the patterns until she was certain. Her voice never wavered, and though she was only 8 years old, Daniel felt as though he were listening to a partner, someone standing at his side rather than beneath his protection. He realized then how blind he had been. He had thought money could fix everything, that a warm bed and good schools and expensive toys were enough to heal the wounds a child carried. But Clara needed none of those things to prove her worth. She needed someone to see her, to hear her, to treat her as more than an obligation. And in that moment, Daniel finally did. She was not a shadow in his house, not a quiet presence he could ignore. She was the reason he still had a chance to fight back against the betrayal closing in around him. As she finished her explanation, she lifted her eyes to his, waiting. Daniel reached across the desk, covering her small hand with his, the gesture firm and certain. "You saved me," he said quietly, "and I'm not going to forget that." For the first time since she had come into his home, Clara smiled. Not the polite, practiced smile she used with strangers, but a real one. Soft and bright, a smile of trust. Daniel had not left his office since Clara showed him the evidence, his thoughts tangled in a storm of disbelief and anger, yet threaded with a strange new clarity. The house that once felt untouchable now seemed fragile, its walls full of cracks, its corners hiding things he had never thought to look for. Clara sat across from him, her small hands folded on the desk, her gaze steady, the glow of her tablet screen casting light across her serious face. She had just shown him proof that his perfect world had been invaded, and though he was a man who prided himself on control, he felt powerless in a way that unsettled him deeply. When he asked her what they should do, expecting perhaps fear or uncertainty, Clara's answer was calm. "We can't do this alone," she said, her voice soft but firm, carrying a conviction that felt too heavy for a child her age. "You don't see everything, but Mrs. Alvarez does." Daniel blinked at the name. Mrs. Alvarez had been with the house for nearly 15 years, first under his parents, and later under him. She managed schedules, groceries, repairs, and the endless details of a home so large it often felt more like a hotel than a residence. She was efficient, quiet, and reliable, the kind of presence that kept the house running so smoothly that he rarely noticed her. In truth, he had never considered her as anything more than part of the background, a figure who made sure the lights stayed on and the room stayed clean. But Clara was looking at him now with the certainty of someone who had seen more than he had, and for the first time he wondered if the housekeeper had noticed the cracks he had ignored. "Why her?" Daniel asked, his voice low. Clara didn't hesitate. "Because she watches. People don't pay attention to her, but she pays attention to them. She's seen Vanessa when you weren't here. She's seen Richard when he thought no one was looking. She listens, and no one thinks she does." The weight of those words settled over Daniel, and he realized how blind he had been. Clara was right. Mrs. Alvarez was the one person who moved through the house freely, unseen in the way staff so often were, but always present. She had probably witnessed more of Vanessa's behavior than either of them, simply because she was invisible to the woman who thought charm was enough to blind anyone. That evening, when the house was quiet and Vanessa had left with a smile that now looked like a mask to him, Daniel asked Mrs. Alvarez to join him in the library. She entered with her usual calm, her hands folded neatly, her dark eyes alert but cautious. She had seen Daniel in every stage of his life, from a boy grieving his parents to a man building an empire. And now she saw the tension in his shoulders and the way Clara stood beside him like a shadow. Clara was the one who spoke, her voice careful but direct as she explained what she had found. She showed Mrs. Alvarez the sketches, the blinking lights, the strange signals. Daniel watched as the housekeeper's face remained steady, though her eyes sharpened with every detail. When Clara finished, Mrs. Alvarez sat quietly for a long moment, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the desk. Then she nodded once, a gesture filled with certainty. "I have seen things too," she said finally, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I did not speak because it was not my place. But now, I will." Daniel realized then that Clara had been right. He had overlooked the one person who had been guarding his house in her quiet way all along. Together, the three of them formed an unlikely alliance, bound not by duty or obligation, but by the understanding that they were now in danger, and that only by standing together could they hope to survive what was coming. Vanessa arrived at the house the next evening with her usual grace, a silk scarf tied neatly around her shoulders, her smile as polished as the shoes that clicked across the marble floor. To anyone else, she looked perfect, the image of a woman who belonged in a world of wealth and power. But to Daniel, Clara, and Mrs. Alvarez, her entrance carried a different weight. Once he might have welcomed her with unguarded warmth, but now he studied her closely, searching for details he had never thought to question before. She kissed his cheek lightly, her perfume leaving a trace of sweetness in the air. But when her eyes flicked toward Clara standing at the base of the staircase, there was the faintest pause, a small crack in her perfect expression. Mrs. Alvarez noticed it too. The housekeeper had lived long enough to recognize when someone's charm was practiced, when every gesture was deliberate. Later, when Vanessa disappeared upstairs to freshen up, Mrs. Alvarez spoke quietly in the library, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She told Daniel how she had found Vanessa in his study more than once when he had not been home, claiming she was tidying or waiting for him, yet always near his desk or the cabinet where files were kept. She recalled the morning she discovered Vanessa in his father's old office at 6 o'clock, standing not near the shelves of books she claimed she wanted, but by the computer, her hand resting on the mouse as though caught mid-act. When Mrs. Alvarez had entered the room, Vanessa had smiled too brightly, her excuse too quick, her tone too smooth. Daniel listened in silence, his chest tightening with every word. He wanted to argue, to defend the woman he had thought he knew, but each memory Mrs. Alvarez recounted fit neatly with the doubts already stirring inside him. Then Clara spoke, her small voice steady as she shared what she had overheard. She told him about nights when she had woken thirsty and passed the kitchen, hearing Vanessa's voice low and hurried on the phone, her words sharp in a way that vanished the moment anyone stepped into view. Clara had heard her mention dates, meetings, timelines, things that sounded nothing like the sweet conversations of a woman in love. She had once even heard Vanessa say his name, followed by words that made no sense until now. Things like extraction and delivery, words that clung to Clara's memory because of the way they were whispered, as if secrets lived inside them. Daniel sat back in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together, his mind replaying months of moments that now felt false. He remembered how Vanessa always seemed to know when to arrive with coffee, how she always called at the exact time a meeting ended, how she had once told him she admired his predictability. He had mistaken it for affection, when in truth it was calculation. The realization left a hollow ache in him, heavier than anger, heavier than fear. He had been living with a stranger, someone who wore a mask of devotion while slowly peeling back the walls of his life. And the cruelest part was how easy it had been for her, how ready he had been to believe in her perfection, because it filled the emptiness he had never admitted aloud. As Vanessa came back into the room, her smile as flawless as before, Daniel saw her differently. He no longer saw a partner, but a performer. And behind the performance, he finally recognized the danger. Daniel had always trusted Richard Hale. They had built the company together, starting in a cramped office with nothing but laptops and long nights. Richard had been at his side through the battles of contracts, investors, and launches, the man who celebrated victories with him and steadied him through losses. To Daniel, Richard was not just a colleague, he was family, the kind of friend who had earned his loyalty in ways money could never buy. That was why Clara's words struck him harder than anything she had said before. It was late, the house quiet, when Clara finally told him. She sat cross-legged on the rug in his office, her tablet glowing in her lap, her voice low but sure as she spoke. "I've seen her with Richard," she said, her eyes never leaving his face. Daniel felt his heart stumble, his mind refusing at first to catch the meaning. "When?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Clara did not flinch. "A few times, always when you're not home. Once she told me she was looking for you in the study, but when I peeked through the hall, Richard was there with her," they whispered. "I heard words like timelines and extraction. They stopped talking when they saw me. Vanessa smiled too much, like she was pretending nothing happened. Richard didn't say anything at all. He just looked at me, then looked away. The silence that followed felt heavy, pressing down on Daniel until he could hardly breathe. Richard, of all people. He tried to picture it, tried to make sense of it. Perhaps Clara had misunderstood. Perhaps she had caught them discussing business in a way that sounded wrong to a child's ears. But even as the thoughts formed, they fell apart. Clara's eyes were too steady, her memory too exact, and the words she had heard were not the kind that belonged in ordinary meetings. Extraction. The word alone sent a chill through him. Mrs. Alvarez, standing quietly by the door, spoke then. "I have seen Mr. Hale arrive when you were away," she said gently. "I thought little of it, because he is your partner, but it is true, he was always with Miss Vanessa, never alone, and they always seemed to pause when I entered the room. I should have told you sooner." Daniel pressed a hand to his forehead, his thoughts racing. The betrayal was almost too much to take in. He could face rivals in the market. He could outthink competitors. But this was different. This was personal. Richard had been inside his home, had been given his trust for years, and now the possibility that he had sold that trust shattered something deep inside. He thought back to their conversations, the late nights in hotel bars during business trips, the promises they had made to each other about loyalty and vision. Had any of it been real? Or had Richard always been waiting for the right moment to betray him? Clara's small voice pulled him from his thoughts. "I think they're planning something big," she said. "That's why she asked so many questions about your work. That's why he comes here when you're gone. They're not just watching, they're waiting." Daniel closed his eyes, the truth cutting deeper than he could admit aloud. His company, his reputation, even his life's work, was at risk, and it was not strangers who had placed him in danger. It was the woman he thought he loved, and the man he thought he could trust above all others. The mansion was quiet, but Daniel could feel the tension humming in its walls, as if the house itself knew it was no longer safe. He sat in his office, staring at the brass clock on the mantel, the tiny red light still pulsing faintly in the dark, a reminder that someone was always listening. Clara stood nearby, her small hands folded around her tablet, her brown eyes steady with the kind of seriousness he had rarely seen in adults. She had been the one to uncover the truth, the one who saw what he had missed, and now she was ready to show him more. "I think we can use it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Daniel turned to her, startled. "Use it? Clara, it's dangerous. Whoever planted these devices is feeding everything back to Vanessa and Richard, maybe even more people. We need to take them out, not play with them." But Clara shook her head, her expression calm and certain. "If we take them out, they'll know we found them. If we leave them, we can make them believe whatever we want. They trust the microphones because they think no one knows about them. That makes them blind. We can use that." Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her. She was 8 years old, yet her words carried the weight of someone who had survived long enough to know the value of turning fear into strategy. "How would we do that?" he asked carefully. Clara walked to the mantel and stood on her toes, pointing at the hidden blink behind the frame. "We talk near it, but only about the things we want them to hear. Fake schedules, fake meetings. Things that sound real, but aren't. If they believe you're going to be somewhere at a certain time, we can watch how they move. And if they try to act on it, we'll know who's behind them." She held up her tablet, scrolling quickly until lines of code and signal maps filled the screen. "I can trace the transmissions. The microphones send data out, but if I intercept them, I can follow the path back to where it goes. Then we'll know who's listening." Daniel stared at her in disbelief, half proud and half afraid. This was not something a child should know. Yet Clara spoke as though it were second nature. She had taken the things she had seen, the scraps of technology around her, and turned them into tools. It frightened him to think about how much she had learned on her own, but it also filled him with awe. She had been invisible in this house, but in truth, She had been watching everything, learning in silence. Mrs. Alvarez, who had been listening quietly from the corner, finally spoke. "She's right," she said softly. "If they believe the house is still blind, we can see their next steps. It is risky, but it is better than letting them control the game." Daniel rubbed a hand over his jaw, the decision pressing heavily on him. To use the devices meant to accept that his own home had become a stage. Every word a performance meant for hidden ears. But Clara's plan was clever, far too clever to dismiss. She had not just exposed the betrayal, she had given them a way to fight back. "All right," he said at last, meeting her gaze. "We do it your way, but we do it carefully." Clara nodded, a small smile flickering across her face, though her eyes stayed sharp. She moved closer to the clock, her voice dropping to a whisper as she demonstrated. "Tomorrow night, you'll say you're leaving for the office late. You won't go. We'll see if they send someone. That's how we'll catch them." For the first time since the nightmare began, Daniel felt something other than fear. He felt resolve. They would not be the hunted anymore. Clara, the child everyone else might have overlooked, had just become their spy, and her plan was brilliant. Vanessa moved through the house with the confidence of someone who believed she had already won. Her smile was brighter, her touch more frequent, her voice filled with sweet insistence as she urged Daniel to relax, to stop worrying so much, to let her shoulder some of the weight of his empire. She began leaving documents on his desk, with little notes, written in her looping handwriting, reminders that he should sign before the deadlines passed. She leaned over his chair during late nights, tracing her manicured finger across the screen as she suggested moving money between accounts for better efficiency. She even began asking casually for his passwords, brushing the request off with a laugh, saying couples should have no secrets. That trust was everything. To anyone else, her actions would have looked like devotion, a woman standing beside the man she loved. To Daniel, now seeing her through Clara's eyes, each gesture felt like a blade carefully pressed against his throat. He played his part well, nodding at the right moments, letting her believe his guard was still down. He smiled when she placed her hand over his, even kissed her cheek when she leaned in close, though inside every muscle was rigid with suspicion. At night, when she finally left the house, he would join Clara and Mrs. Alvarez in the library, where the child's tablet glowed like a secret lantern in the dark. Clara's counterplan was unfolding piece by piece, and Daniel found himself relying on her in ways he never thought possible. Clara sat cross-legged on the rug, scrolling through intercepted transmissions with a focus that made her seem far older than her years. She had begun feeding carefully chosen pieces of false information into the bugs scattered around the house. She whispered fake schedules near the clock on the mantel, left staged phone calls within earshot of the vase in the living room, even spoke softly about deals that never existed while sitting on the edge of his bed so the device in the nightstand would catch it. Each false detail was bait, designed to lure Vanessa and Richard into showing their hands. It worked. Within days, Clara traced a surge of signals leaving the house and arriving at secure servers tied to Apex Global, the rival firm Daniel had long suspected of circling his company. The red dots on Clara's map pulsed brighter, their movements more frequent, as if the people behind them were preparing for something big. And all the while, Vanessa pressed harder, her charm growing thinner as her demands sharpened. Daniel watched her carefully, and though her beauty and confidence still stirred something in him, the mask was slipping. There were moments when she thought no one was looking, when her smile faded into a hard line, when her eyes narrowed with calculation instead of affection. Mrs. Alvarez noticed too, recalling how Vanessa lingered in the study longer than necessary, her fingers tracing over the files as though memorizing their positions. Clara, sharp-eyed as always, pointed out the way Vanessa's tone shifted when she spoke to Daniel about trust, how it sounded less like love and more like command. The net was tightening, but it was not Daniel caught inside it. Not anymore. Each night, as he listened to Clara explain her progress, as he watched Mrs. Alvarez nod in quiet agreement, he felt something stronger than fear rising in his chest. He felt prepared. Vanessa and Richard thought they were circling their prey, but they had no idea the prey had teeth. Daniel decided it was time to test her. The evidence against Vanessa was already heavy, but part of him still longed for a reason to believe she was innocent. He had spent months letting her into his home, his company, even into the quiet corners of his heart, and tearing away that image left a hollow ache he did not want to face. So one evening, as they sat in the study with the fireplace casting a soft glow across the room, he let his voice carry just enough suspicion to see how she would respond. "You've been spending a lot of time in here lately," he said casually, his tone light, his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. "Sometimes even when I'm not home." Vanessa paused, her hand mid-air as she reached for her wine glass. Then she smiled, tilting her head the way she always did when she wanted to look playful. "I like being close to your work, Daniel. It makes me feel like I'm part of your world." Her words were sweet, but there was something too smooth about them, something rehearsed. Daniel let the silence stretch, as though considering her answer, then asked, "And the phone calls Clara says she's overheard? Late at night, in the kitchen?" That was when the tears came, perfectly timed, glistening in her green eyes as her voice caught, "Daniel, how can you even ask me that? I thought you trusted me. I thought what we had was real." She stood, moving toward him with trembling hands, her face a portrait of hurt. "You've been so stressed. Maybe you're starting to imagine things. Or maybe someone is trying to put doubts in your head. Don't let them come between us." Her performance was flawless, her voice breaking in just the right places, her tears falling with the precision of someone who had practiced this role many times before. And for a moment, Daniel felt himself slipping. He remembered the laughter they had shared, the quiet nights when she rested her head on his shoulder, the comfort of having someone waiting at home for him. It would be easier to believe her, easier to push aside the doubts, and return to the illusion of safety. But then he saw Clara, standing in the doorway. She had come silently, her small hands clutching her tablet against her chest, her face unreadable. She didn't speak, didn't interrupt, but the look in her eyes was sharper than any words. It was the look of someone who had been ignored before, someone who knew exactly how adults let themselves be fooled because they wanted lies to be true. Daniel felt the shame of that gaze pierce him. Clara had given him proof, had shown him details and signals and sketches that could not be denied. And yet, here he was, nearly undone by a few tears and a trembling voice. Her silence reminded him of what was at stake, not just his company, but the fragile trust of a child who had dared to believe someone would finally listen to her. He turned back to Vanessa, his voice steady now. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I am imagining things. But I think it's best if we leave work out of our relationship for a while." Vanessa studied him for a beat too long before nodding, her expression smoothing back into perfection. Daniel forced a smile, but his mind was no longer wavering. Clara's silent disappointment had anchored him. He would not choose comforting lies over hard truths again. Clara sat on the rug in Daniel's office, with her tablet glowing softly in her lap, her legs folded neatly beneath her, as she explained her plan with the calm certainty of someone who had already thought through every step. Daniel listened in silence, his hand pressed against his chin, while Mrs. Alvarez stood nearby with her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed with both concern and admiration. The idea was simple but clever. If Vanessa and Richard trusted the hidden devices scattered around the mansion, then those devices could be turned into bait. Instead of trying to tear them out, Clara wanted to feed them lies, and in those lies would be a trail leading straight back to whoever was pulling the strings. The next morning, Daniel found himself acting out a performance he never thought he would give, speaking aloud as though he were dictating notes to himself, while Clara lingered by the mantel where the clock blinked faintly in the shadows. "The final designs will be printed Thursday night," he said in a measured voice, his eyes fixed on the stack of fake files Clara had created. Once the shipment is ready, we'll move it directly to the vault downtown. He let his words carry just enough weight to sound authentic. Knowing the bug was listening, Clara, pretending to be absorbed in her tablet, added in her small, clear voice, "That's the night you won't be home then, right?" She spoke with the kind of innocence that could never be rehearsed, making the trap all the more convincing. Daniel gave her a quick look of approval, then answered in the same steady tone, "Yes, I'll be at the office all night. No one should know, of course." The documents she had planted were waiting on his desk, stamped with bold red lettering that read "Confidential," though in reality they were filled with meaningless equations and nonsense contracts. To an untrained eye they looked genuine, dangerous even, but Daniel knew they were nothing more than bait. That night, Clara sat beside him in the library as her tablet mapped the flow of signals leaving the house. Her small fingers tapped rapidly across the screen, her face glowing with concentration. She whispered updates to Daniel and Mrs. Alvarez as she worked, describing how the devices were transmitting the false information in real time. A trail of red lines began to appear on the map, tracing the signals through layers of networks, bouncing across servers before landing on one final location. Clara's eyes widened slightly, and her voice grew sharp. "I found it," she said. "They're sending everything to Apex Global." Daniel's chest tightened as the name appeared on the screen. Apex Global was his fiercest rival, the one company that had tried to undercut him in every contract battle, the one competitor that had the money and ambition to crush him if given the chance. Now, there was no doubt. Vanessa had not just been a deceiver in his personal life. She had been a spy planted in his home, feeding his secrets straight to the enemy. For a long moment the room was silent, except for the faint ticking of the brass clock upstairs. Then Clara leaned back against the chair, a small, satisfied smile tugging at her lips. She had done it. With nothing but her sharp eyes and a tablet held together with tape, she had outsmarted professionals who thought themselves untouchable. Daniel looked at her with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride because she had saved him, and sorrow because a child should never have needed to learn such things. But the proof was there now, undeniable. And for the first time, Daniel felt the weight of betrayal shift into something else: anger. The mask Vanessa had worn was cracking, and soon the whole world would see who she really was. The night of the sting arrived with the weight of a storm, heavy and tense. Though the skies above the mansion were clear, Daniel stood in his office with the curtains half drawn, the glow of his computer screen casting pale light across his face, his voice calm as he rehearsed the lines he knew the bugs would capture. On the mantel, the brass clock ticked steadily, its hidden eye blinking softly, still unaware that the trap had already been laid. Clara sat cross-legged on the rug with her tablet in her lap, her small fingers tapping quickly as she monitored the flow of signals leaving the house. Mrs. Alvarez moved silently between the rooms, her presence steady, her phone tucked discreetly in her pocket, keeping contact with the agents parked discreetly outside the gates. Daniel had agreed to involve the FBI only after Clara's evidence became undeniable. Apex Global was not just a competitor, it was a predator, and Vanessa and Richard were its agents inside his life. The sting had been planned carefully, with every detail rehearsed until the roles felt natural. Daniel would play the distracted executive, still unaware of betrayal. Clara would continue to feed hints into the microphones, guiding Vanessa and Richard toward what they believed was their prize. Mrs. Alvarez would keep watch, noting every movement with the quiet sharpness of someone who had spent her life observing from the edges. At precisely 9 o'clock, Daniel's phone buzzed with a message from Richard. A delay in shipment, it said, meet tonight to review. Daniel showed it to Clara, who only nodded, her eyes steady. He's moving fast, she said. That means they believe it. They'll come here. Sure enough, just after 10, Vanessa arrived, her smile dazzling as always, her scarf fluttering as she swept through the door. She kissed Daniel's cheek, told him he worked too hard, and suggested they share a quiet glass of wine before bed. But her eyes flicked toward the office almost immediately, a glance so quick most would have missed it. Daniel let her lead him into conversation, let her laugh softly at his half-hearted jokes. While upstairs, Mrs. Alvarez discreetly noted the way she kept checking her phone. Minutes later, Richard entered through the side gate, a key in his hand, his expression taut and serious. Clara, watching through the security feeds on her tablet, whispered, "He's here." Daniel pretended not to notice, his voice carrying easily toward the bug in the clock as he murmured about the confidential designs waiting in the study. That was all it took. Vanessa excused herself with a practiced smile, saying she needed to make a call, and slipped into the office where Richard was already waiting. The two moved quickly, their voices hushed, their hands rifling through the files Clara had prepared. They found exactly what they were looking for, unaware that every word and every gesture was being streamed to the FBI outside. Clara leaned closer to her tablet, her face glowing with determination as the screen filled with captured transmissions. "We've got them," she whispered. Daniel stepped into the doorway then, his presence calm but unyielding. Vanessa froze, her mask cracking for the first time, while Richard's face hardened with panic. Before either could speak, lights flooded the windows, and the sound of engines filled the driveway. Agents swarmed the house, their shouts echoing through the halls, the sting snapping shut with finality. For a long moment Daniel stood silently, his eyes on the woman he had thought he loved, and the man he had trusted like a brother. The betrayal cut deep, but the evidence was there now, undeniable, every move recorded, every secret exposed. Clara stepped up beside him, her small frame steady, her eyes locked on Vanessa with a fierceness beyond her years. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, the weight of it both protective and grateful. They had won the first battle. The house was no longer quiet. Sirens cut through the night as agents moved swiftly through the mansion, voices firm and commanding as they secured each room. Daniel stood in the center of his office, the weight of years of trust and illusion collapsing around him, while Vanessa and Richard were cornered at last. For a moment, Vanessa tried to keep her mask in place, her eyes wide with practiced innocence, her voice trembling as she asked how he could possibly think she would betray him. But the charm that once seemed unshakable faltered under the bright light of truth. When the agents produced the files they had just tried to steal, when Clara's traced transmissions were shown on the screens, Vanessa's performance crumbled. Her shoulders straightened, her tears vanished, and her smile hardened into something cruel. The woman who had once kissed his cheek and whispered devotion was gone. In her place stood a professional who had played this role many times before, her voice cold and sharp as she spat out words that revealed the truth Daniel had refused to see. She admitted nothing directly, yet every flicker of disdain in her expression, every mocking tone in her laugh, made it clear she had done this before. He could almost imagine the other men, successful executives who had fallen under her spell, destroyed one by one while she walked away untouched. She had perfected the art of weaving herself into someone's life and then tearing it apart from the inside. Richard was worse in a different way. He did not try to deny it. When the agents placed evidence of his wire transfers on the desk, he did not flinch, though a shadow of shame crossed his face. He looked at Daniel, the man he had built an empire with, and for a moment there was almost regret in his eyes. But greed had already eaten too deeply into him. "It was never personal," he said flatly, though his voice cracked. "It was business. You had everything, Daniel, and I was tired of standing in your shadow. Apex gave me a way out." His words sliced deeper than any knife, not because of their cruelty, but because of their truth. Daniel had trusted him, leaned on him, believed in him, and now realized that betrayal had lived close at hand for far too long. It was Clara who shifted their rage. Vanessa's cold eyes turned toward her first, narrowing with recognition. The child who had stood so quiet in the background had been the one to see through them, the one who had drawn diagrams and fed false trails, the one who had destroyed their perfect plan. Richard's jaw tightened as he followed Vanessa's gaze, and in their silence, Daniel felt the unspoken danger rise. They hated her for outsmarting them, for being the smallest person in the room, yet the sharpest mind. Clara stood close to Daniel, her hand gripping the edge of his jacket. Her chin lifted, though her eyes were wide. Vanessa took a step forward, restrained only by the agents at her side, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you're clever, little girl," she hissed, "but you don't know what kind of people you've crossed." Daniel moved instantly, pulling Clara behind him, his voice firm and steady. "You'll never touch her. Not now, not ever." The agents closed in tighter, but the weight of Vanessa's glare lingered in the air like poison. For the first time, Daniel understood the true scale of the enemy he had been up against. And for the first time, he knew he had survived only because Clara had refused to be silent. The glamorous mask was gone, the betrayal laid bare, and though the confrontation was painful, Daniel felt clarity cut through the haze at last. He had been blind, but not anymore. Weeks passed, and the mansion that had once felt like a stage for deception was slowly transformed into something else entirely. Richard and Vanessa were no longer part of Daniel's world. They sat in federal custody, their names splashed across headlines, their crimes exposed for everyone to see. The FBI called it one of the most sophisticated cases of corporate espionage they had ever unraveled. But Daniel knew the truth was simpler than that. It had not been a government agency or a team of professionals who saved him. It had been a child who refused to stay silent, who had whispered the words he had almost ignored, who had seen through lies he was too willing to believe. Daniel finalized Clara's adoption in a quiet courtroom on a gray morning, the kind of place where papers changed lives with signatures and stamps. The judge smiled warmly as Clara held Daniel's hand, her small fingers clutching his as if she wanted to make sure the moment was real. When the gavel came down, sealing what they had both already chosen in their hearts, Daniel looked at her and felt something break open inside him. He had thought of adoption as duty before, an obligation born out of the wealth and privilege he carried. But as Clara smiled up at him, her eyes brighter than he had ever seen, he realized he had not saved her. She had saved him. The mansion itself bore the scars of betrayal, but Daniel was determined to change that. Every hidden microphone and camera was stripped from the walls, every suspicious gift boxed up and taken away. What remained was silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of peace. The kind that came when you knew no one was watching anymore. Into that space, Clara's laughter began to spill, filling the rooms with a warmth Daniel had not known he was missing. He gave her freedom to make the house her own. The study that had once been a place of secrecy now had her sketches taped across the walls, diagrams and drawings, mingling with his business awards. The living room, where the crystal vase had once hidden a device, now held Clara's art supplies, pencils and markers scattered across the table. The long, cold hallways echoed less with the sound of polished shoes and more with the sound of Clara's running footsteps, her joy turning the house into a home. Mrs. Alvarez, who had stood with them through every moment, seemed younger now, her sharp eyes softer as she watched the bond between Daniel and Clara grow. She often said that the house finally felt alive, and Daniel knew she was right. He found himself working less, spending more time listening to Clara, not just to her discoveries but to her stories, her hopes, her laughter. She had become the truest part of his life, the one who reminded him every day that love was not something earned through wealth or power, but something built through trust. One evening, as they sat together in the library, Clara curled up beside him with a sketchbook in her lap. She looked up and whispered, "We're really a family now, aren't we?" Daniel felt his chest tighten with emotion as he pulled her close. "Yes," he said softly, "we're really a family now." And for the first time, the mansion did not feel like glass walls and shadows. It felt like home. The night was quiet, except for the low hum of the city beyond the tall windows. Daniel sat at his desk, papers spread in neat piles, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows across the room. For years this sight had been his comfort, the endless rhythm of work, a shield against loneliness. But tonight it felt different. The house no longer carried the weight of secrets or the tension of betrayal. It carried Clara's presence, and that changed everything. He was deep in thought, reviewing contracts and numbers, when he felt the gentle tug at his sleeve. Clara had padded into the study barefoot, her hair loose around her face, a sketchbook tucked under her arm. She did not speak right away, just stood beside him and watched as he worked, her curious eyes following every movement of his pen. He glanced down at her, half smiling, and asked if she could not sleep. She shook her head, her lips twitching, as if she carried some secret she was not ready to share. For so long her whispers had come with fear. They had been warnings of danger, soft admissions of truths she was too small to carry alone. Daniel remembered every one of them, each one cutting through the noise of his world and forcing him to see what he had missed. Those whispers had saved him, saved his company, and more than that, saved the part of himself he thought had been lost to ambition. Tonight, though, her whisper was different. Clara leaned close, her eyes bright with mischief, and said in a hushed voice, "Don't forget your coffee." She giggled as she said it, knowing how many times she had caught him distracted and leaving it untouched, the steam fading into nothing. For a moment Daniel simply stared at her, then laughter broke from him, warm and full, echoing off the walls in a way that felt strange and yet so natural. He pulled her into his lap, setting the pen aside, and held her close as she laughed too, her small frame shaking with the joy of the moment. The sound of her voice lingered in his mind long after the words themselves faded. It was no longer the trembling voice of a girl unsure if she would be believed, no longer the fearful whisper of someone watching shadows gather around her. It was the confident, playful sound of a daughter who felt safe, who trusted that her words would always be heard. Daniel realized that her voice had become the most important part of his life, the one sound he never wanted to overlook again. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the papers on his desk no longer seemed urgent. What mattered was the warmth of the child in his arms, the life they were building together, and the laughter that had replaced silence in the mansion's halls. Daniel whispered back to her, promising that from now on he would always listen, not just to her words but to the life they carried. Clara smiled, her head resting on his shoulder, and for the first time in his long career, Daniel felt no need to measure his worth by his work. His fortune was here, in this small voice that meant everything. If this story moved you, like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.